Let me bring in Professor David Paton of Nottingham University's Business School and a member of Economists for Free Trade. You're not of the view, of course, that a no-deal Brexit is necessarily a disaster.
No, it's not necessarily a disaster. It's not the ideal outcome. We'd like to have a free trade agreement. I think all parties would like that. But there are some advantages from a no-deal Brexit. So I agree completely with Guy that businesses want certainty, and that's one of the things a no-deal Brexit would give, rather sooner than some sort of fudged Brexit where there's endless debates over the future arrangements for a number of years to come. There's also the issue that I think people sometimes forget that Brexit can bring some costs, but there's also lots of economic opportunities for businesses. And the sooner that Brexit happens and the sort of the cleaner that Brexit is, the easier it is to achieve those sort of gains. For example, the fiscal boost from not having to pay the huge sums we do each year to the European Union, the easier trade that we can have with non-EU countries, and most importantly, the ability to end the protectionist EU, whereby the price of imports from non-EU countries are forced up to the detriment of consumers and indeed businesses who rely on importing intermediate goods.
So are you saying that ultimately the UK will be better off once the break is made?
Well, that's a matter of judgment. I think there's an interesting disconnect, almost parallel universes going on between the endless predictions of a doomsday scenario under any Brexit outcome, as we've seen from the Treasury and many others. And that was going on before the referendum and since. But at the same time, we've had the real economic data, which has told a slightly different story. So growth has held up reasonably well. Unemployment is at record lows. We've seen businesses from overseas investing in the UK at pretty high levels. So there were worries about FDI, and FDI is based on future expectations of the economy. So what's going to happen under any scenario? And that's held up at really high levels, much higher than in the rest of the EU. So I think that the evidence we have so far from the real economy suggests that, well, there's no reason to expect a doomsday scenario. In every single outcome we have, whether it's a free trade deal or a no deal or some sort of intermediate Canada Plus deal or the Chequers Agreement, there are some costs to business and some benefits. And I think for me, what I would hope we should be doing is looking to the future. There's been so much emphasis on the short-term costs, and some of those are, of course, real. But the danger is we forget about the long-term opportunities for businesses to exploit the growing parts of the world that are growing much faster than most of the EU, the ability to reconnect our relationships with parts of the Commonwealth in Africa, the CANZAC countries, the US and so on. There's really exciting opportunities which can come from Brexit, of course, only if we retain the ability to sort of direct our own economic policy.
I suppose that the difficulty, though, in a no-deal scenario is it's not a nice, smooth glide path out onto a WTO arrangement. It would be extraordinarily bumpy, and you could be in a situation where you actually end up in a recessionary situation where some certain sectors experience large dislocation. So I think the difficulties for business is businesses will always see the opportunity, and there may be a long-term opportunity, but the short-term costs are very, very real for some sectors. Our agri-food sector, for example, is one of those highly exposed areas where if we end up in an uncontrolled no-deal Brexit, then there are immediately tariffs in place. They're immediately subject to strict EU rules on food and animal health, which would really damage that industry and probably put people out of business. So that's where the fear lies, I feel.
That's understandable, but we have to be a bit careful. No deal can mean many different things. I think what we're talking about here is no formal trade deal between the EU and the UK. That doesn't mean there's not sectoral agreements or regulatory agreements to make sure trade still happens.
There's a difference between, if you like, a managed no deal, which some people seem to think would happen, and an actual, if you like, a hard no deal, which is to say there's nothing there.
Yeah, I don't think there's any prospect at all of that. I mean, the EU certainly can't afford to have that, and the Republic of Ireland can't afford to have that, and neither can the UK. So in terms of business keeping going, there's many countries that trade with the EU that aren't in the EU. There may be bumps on the road, but there's also ways of limiting those bumps. So straight away, we can, if we decide, do something about our import tariffs. We can do something about regulations and the way we deal with goods at the border. It would certainly be illegal for the EU to suddenly impose higher regulatory standards. We're starting from a position where our regulations agree entirely with the EU.
Illegal where? Illegal how?
under WTO rules.
Is that the SPS agreement?
Yes,
I think
indeed.
you might have overinterpreted what's actually possible under that.
Yeah, but what states can't do is suddenly impose things which make trade more difficult unreasonably. That's a sort of fairly standard principle of WTO terms.
Professor Paton, how easy are trade deals going to be the other side of Brexit?
Well, with the EU, of course, it's relatively easy because we've got alignment already. Trade deals can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. The simplest trade deal where you're reducing tariffs can be done relatively quickly. There's lots of models out there and clearly lots of enthusiasm from countries such as Canada and we saw yesterday from Japan and other countries. So they're certainly possible. So people sometimes say, the Canada deal took 7 years to take place. Well, the Canada deal has happened with the EU and we're in a very similar situation, so it certainly wouldn't take that long. With the UK. Just one thing I'd like to go back to on the backstop, and a question I don't hear journalists ask very much, which is what would the EU do in the event of no deal in terms of the Northern Ireland border? Would they insist on the Republic putting up a hard border? And I suspect the answer is no, but it seems to me that is the solution really to the backstop agreement. What would happen in a no-deal situation? Presumably the Republic and the UK would work to ensure there was no hard border and as frictionless trade as possible, and that should give the model for the backstop agreement. And it's always been paradoxical, I think, that the harder we work to prepare for a no deal, the less likely no deal is. And in fact, one of the reasons we're in this situation is that the Chancellor has just refused to do significant preparations for a no deal. And that's really the task now. Not that it's the best outcome, but we really do need, as Guy said, to work harder with businesses to prepare for that no deal scenario, making it therefore much less likely to happen because it then becomes a credible threat from the UK side.